Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, From Activity to Impact, How COVID Has Changed Training in the Workplace. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and David Proegler. David is a Managing Principal with Latitude, leading sales, client, and partner relationship development. David has nearly 25 years as a results-driven leader in business management consulting, with extensive experience in the automotive industry building and delivering solutions. His ability to synthesize business objectives, technology platforms, and custom development into orchestrated solutions is key to helping organizations with a learning solution that optimizes performance across the entire value chain. I would like to extend a thank you to Latitude for sponsoring today's webinar. Latitude CG, home of Latitude Learning, the partner learning for platform, is designed for the unique needs of partner training programs to train the people that sell, service, and use your products. Geographically dispersed partner networks have a level of organizational complexity that cannot be supported by an HR LMS. Latitude Learning was designed to support the complexity of partner training and give the visibility partner organizations need to training compliance and potential vulnerabilities with gaps exist. Latitude has been providing solutions for companies globally for more than 30 years. More than 3 million people have successfully used Latitude Learning. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Brandon Hall Group is a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that our Excellence Award Spring program is now open for submissions. We've added about a dozen categories across program areas, so be sure to visit our website for the latest. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components for our research. If you see any surveys on our schedule that you can participate in, it is always greatly appreciated. All participants receive a piece of complimentary research once the results are analyzed. You can also visit our website and click Open Surveys for the latest list. And finally, a few logistics. This presentation is being recorded. The recording and slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenter. And if you would like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section. And without further delay, let's turn it over to Dave and dive right in.
Great, thanks, Corinne. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And get familiar with where the question box there is in your control panel, because that is how you're going to want to communicate with us today. If you have any questions, or if you just want to share some thoughts, that's where you're going to want to do it. I'll be keeping an eye on those as we go, trying to answer any relevant questions in real time, as well as we'll have a little bit of time at the end to get to any questions we may have missed or any new ones that might come in. So before we really just dive into this whole thing, I want to at least let David, and I know there's two of us here, two Davids. I'm going to let David Proegler talk a little bit about the Latitude information exchanges, where a lot of the material that we're going to discuss comes from. So Dave, if you could just sort of explain to people where a lot of the information came from that we're talking about today.
Appreciate it, Dave and Corey. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. We, Latitude has been doing this for a while, and as an effort to stay abreast of what the market is doing, we've engaged in several, what we call information exchanges. And one of the ones we were doing last year and going out was in the midst of the pandemic. And we actually landed on this topic during that discussion. And it was a follow-up to that we felt was vitally important. Our methodology for this was to really go out and interview people that are in our target segment, both customers of ours, potential customers of ours, and people that we've had engagements with along the way. We've actually done about 40 different interviews with franchise and OEM manufacturing organizations. We focus on training executives and managers, and it was really meant to be a conversational exchange in that process. It was a very open-ended question. Next thing you know, we've talked for half an hour to get information from that. We also sent out surveys, survey data with similar questions to our larger audience, and we got respondents back. So a lot of the data that we've collected has been through those two mechanisms. Our focus is really, as we look at the entire population, we've really grouped into two major groups. Franchise organizations that really were focused on franchisee onboarding, ongoing training, associate management and education, ongoing engagement and motivation encouragement. And these were really blended learning programs with a heavy lean towards in-person pre-COVID. On the OEM and manufacturing side, sales, service, and parts kind of training along the way. Blended learning always with a heavy lean on with sales being e-learning primarily and services and operations, leaning more towards the LT side. So that was the nature of the programs we were dealing with pre-COVID, and the conversation really evolved from there to understand how things changed amid all that we experienced from the when COVID hit.
Yeah, and I think this is what's really important about what we're going to talk about today is that we're going to get some, real world perspective on how companies are managing this. I know, look, we all are very aware, right? What happened over about a year or so ago, and it's just there's no other way to really describe it. It was chaos, especially in the early days. It was a question of, is this really happening? Okay, this is really happening. What's the scale of it? What's the scope of it? Is it the next 2 weeks? Is it the next 2 months? Now, is it the next 2 years? And and as much as we wrap our heads around it, we've had all this time, this 12, 16 months to sort of figure this stuff out. We still aren't really 100% sure of what's next.
That is true. I mean, sorry to step in. As we look at this, there are a couple of things that we looked at in this whole thing. Again, chaos is a very good word for it. We all remember that 30 days before March 13th last year, COVID didn't have a name. 2 weeks before, we were saying, this might be something we need to be worried about. 7 days before, oh, this is something important, then things shut down, right? We all went through that confusion, right? But then training the extended enterprise had a lot more things that had to be dealt with at the time, in terms of people being out in the field and how are you going to address it? And like you said just a few seconds ago, is this going to be a 1 week shutdown, a 2 week shutdown, a 2 year shutdown? All the things that went on as you moved further away from that point in time, right? Just a few weeks later, we heard organizations that had never not done training. We heard an international airline shut down their pilot training facilities for nearly 2 months. They hadn't been shut down in 10 years. They were in 365 days a year because it was such an important thing, right? As we move forward a little bit in that, we heard organizations started to were being usurped with regards to or commandeered to train in COVID, even among all the uncertainty that was going on. And lastly, we heard organizations that were, having their training tests pulled away because they were a medical equipment OEM that relied on our ends to actually do the delivery of training. And what ultimately happened was they were pulled away to actually become frontline workers. And that's really where chaos happened. And I think to some extent, it lingers today.
Yeah, it does. And, we look at sort of, where we were prior, and, nearly 70% of companies said, well, it's less than a quarter of our workforce is remote, right? And then overnight, anybody that can be remote is remote. And David, in your world, there's a lot of folks that there is no such thing as work from home, right? There's a lot of hands-on, and you're in the field. So it's either you're still working, or there's this, uncertain shutdown until when can we get back to things being normal. And, when we asked, okay, once you've sort of figured out your return to work strategy, whatever that may be, what do you think the breakdown is going to be for remote work in the future? And so just basically what we found is that there's clearly going to be, from an office worker standpoint, there will be more remote work in the future than there was prior, right? So there will be a lot of people coming back, but not everybody is going to come back. And that's one of the biggest sort of unknowns right now is, what does that return to work strategy look like? What's the blend? And a lot of organizations don't exactly know when they're going to have this figured out. Some say, well, we already figured that out at the end of last year, or the beginning of this year. Others are looking through the end of this year to figure out what does it look like as people start to come back. And as we go through this, we're talking companies. You see there's a lot of different models. There are definitely organizations that say, look, this is who we are. We want everybody back. That's how we live. That's how we operate. And that makes sense for them. And so that's what's going to happen. Others are like, it turns out remote work is great. We're probably going to stay remote. We're saving on real estate, and overhead and what have you. And people are happy to be at home. And then you're going to see a lot of stuff in the middle, right? Where some people will remain home. Some people will come back. Some people will do both. Some will do it on a fixed schedule. Some will do it ad hoc. And so now that just adds to this sort of chaos and uncertainty of, if you're never really sure who's going to be where, when, how do you plan for that? And how do you make that work in the L&D environment? And at the same time as all of this is happening, organizations are feeling a pinch, right? So, uncertainty tends to lead to tighter budgets. And of course, the impact on the economy means that there's going to be a budget impact as well. So when, companies were heading into 2020, 33% said we're going to do heavy investment in L&D. 43% said we're going to do moderate, investment in L&D, but only 3% said none. But then you look into, when we asked at the end of last year, what are you going to do for 2021? Only 13% of companies felt that they were going to be able to do heavy investment in learning and development. So now that whole picture has changed. So not only do we have to figure out how to operate in this new environment, we have to figure out how to do that at a time when we might not have the resources we typically had. We saw nearly half of companies said, whatever we've budgeted out per learner, whatever our learning audiences are, whatever that budget happens to be per learner, that is now smaller than it was, and it will continue to be smaller than it was. And so this whole idea of this is all changed now. We have to figure out how to do things differently, and we have to do it with not only the resources we are familiar with having, but with fewer resources. So it's just it's an interesting time, and I think that's why it's really important to sort of dig into these information exchanges to really get on the ground and see, okay, how are organizations reacting when they're faced with this?
Right, and to parallel that, I mean, obviously we're talking in the last couple slides about employees going back and return to work strategies, but when we talk about the environments that we're familiar with, what we call the extended enterprise, how are they going to return back to normal with regards to training strategies? Because they're the life's blood of what organizations do, and given all the uncertainty, we saw organizations immediately go away, stop all training, then slowly bring it on. We saw organizations, try to immediately pivot and go to new technology. We saw very few actually that stepped away from it and just sort of said, we'll hold on and wait till things clear. But again, that sort of leads to the uncertainty of how you build these programs. I think it's sort of a lot of the conversation we've had throughout this to sort of build out our understanding, which has been really fascinating.
Well, and so the first place we want us to stop is, this is something that we've heard for a long time, right? When we talk about the speed of business change, and this is prior to the pandemic, it was always a topic of conversation of, well, business changes so fast, and these large organizations, they can't make that kind of turn. The pandemic presented a very unique environment where it was sort of everything had to change, and so, David, in your discussions with people with these organizations, you found out a lot of them, most of them, when they are that size, they did find a way to make this change.
Yeah, it was really very fascinating because, I mean, the consistent theme throughout everything we did was, whether we're talking to large companies or small companies, was they were impressed with how, or they all to a person said they were amazed at how fast they were able to pivot, right? Often going against standard practices to keep performing the training missions in the process, really dragging the organizations along to actually, hey, you got to do this if we want to keep doing what we need to do, right? When we talk about, with regard, we have one good example in this whole thing. There's several good examples, but what I'll highlight here is we had a major automotive OEM describe the reaction after the chaos, saying that they shut down tech training centers and were immediately with uncertainty how to proceed forward in the larger sense. But the technical trainers figured it out, right? What they did was they went home, they pulled out their own technology, they signed up for Zoom, they signed up for WebEx, they brought cameras out, and they figured out how they're going to train, and so they were prepared to move forward in that process. Right, and in that, from the ground up, they were able to move forward. The organization decided they could do this, and what we heard consistently was, the technology that had prior to COVID, technology was one of those things where they would review it. Some of it was supported, some of it wasn't. And in most cases, large organizations would have done long-term pilots who have taken years to complete. But because of COVID, they were able to move quickly through that process. And what we noted from the data that we gathered was about 95% of the organizations we interviewed adapted their training programs. The exceptions, the 5% that didn't, were really focused on the, in organizations that either couldn't because they had physical limitations. They had a 5,000-gallon tank that they used to simulate hazardous waste. They had obviously pilot simulators that had to be used and rigorous requirements from that perspective. A small portion of them said, look, we either don't have the wherewithal or we don't have the knowledge of how long it's going to last, and so they held back on what was going on from a transition perspective. Of the people that we talked about 75 of those that adapted did so immediately, meaning within 2 to 3 months, they were back up and operational. They were able to actually begin to deliver training in some way, shape, or form and continue what they were doing operationally. The next one. A good thing is a lot of the organizations had initiatives in place with regards to virtual technologies, with regards to online meetings and those kinds of things, but all those activities were pulled forward and accelerated, and those that actually had them had a better reaction to the chaos that ensued. Right. They were able to continue, and 50% of the organization were able to continue training without any impact or delay on their formal training programs. It means they were able to keep pace what was going on. They were able to onboard new franchisees. They were able to keep people trained and educated so they could move them along and keep them certified and those kinds of things along the way. And 100% of those adapted indicated they had never seen their organizations move as quickly as they did under COVID. So this is really a good example of how organizations thrived under this, to much of everyone's surprise as we went through this.
Yeah, and we've also been doing a lot of interviews with organizations in conjunction with our surveys and other research, and a similar story is a lot of the technologies and things that companies are using in this environment were a lot of the things that were already coming around prior to the pandemic, right? A more digital approach, using a wider variety of technologies. And so those companies that were already doing those things, already down that road, were in a much better position and were able to accelerate those positions rather than starting over from scratch.
Right. I think one of the things that I wanted to mention in that example, that OEM example at the very beginning I was going through, the amazing thing about it was they actually went from an organization that was doing heavy tech training, ILT, in person, to sending everyone home, closing their tech centers down. Their techs were going back and using, literally setting up studios in the garage, figuring out how this technology worked, and then bringing it forward back to the organization so they could immediately start training. And I say immediately, again, within weeks and months of when things initially shut down. But the neat thing is that those things have become standard in their training facility. You go into their training facility now, they have high-end cameras, they have training sessions on how to use this technology more effectively. They actually have much higher production value, and as a result, they have higher motivated and highly engaged training staff to be able to deliver what they can in this remote sense. So it really was a very important topic for people.
Yeah, and so based on what what we've heard from these folks and the things that we've seen, and David and I thought about this a little bit, and so the recommendation in as a result of this concept of organizations thinking, well, we're too big to change, or we can't make this kind of adjustment, is take this experience to recognize that when push comes to shove and these changes have to be made, they can be, and you can use this experience to sort of accelerate those kinds of changes, that sort of digital transformation, the kind of things that were sort of already in play prior to the pandemic, just showing that in order for the organization to be more agile and adaptable to these kinds of changes, they need to do this stuff and do it more aggressively in a more timely manner and be more prepared for the next time things change.
Right, and definitely.
So the next piece is that when you were talking to these folks is it's focused on the trainers themselves.
Yeah, the reality is that we don't want to lose sight of this. Trainers in the extended enterprise already play an interesting role. They're obviously a liaison to your organization. They're being the front to these individuals that are probably not your employees. They're your partners, they're franchisees. They're the technicians coming in that you have no relationship with along the way. The important thing was that they really are the ones that were driving a lot of the change, right? Like the previous example where the technicians went off and figured things out. We also heard consistently that the trainers just wanted to move forward in this process. They were key in going out and adapting and learning the technology. We spoke to a franchise organization that had a lot of had a lot of different things they were doing, but their primary thing was, the people we were talking to were focused on engaging trainers or engaging organizations and doing franchisee onboarding. That was typically done in a very long period of time. It was the trainers that were able to actually go back, look at the content that was being delivered over a multiple day period, and be able to refactor it and put it into play immediately. And those things are really instrumental. What we heard was trainers were the first to pivot and asking the question, how do they train, right? They were adapted to new technology, often, as we said earlier, going back and looking at new things themselves. But how can we leverage the technology in a different kind of way? How can we use it to make our jobs better? Trainer used their own tools and creativity to deliver hands-on training. They were going out and they were refactoring the training that they were familiar with and delivering in different kinds of ways. Trainers adapted, organizations follow, as we've said a couple times. There's a very consistent theme out there that the trainers were doing the pushing. The trainers said, look, we have a mission. We have to go out and do this and be able to make sure we can continue our mission to train the people that we have responsibilities for. But one other thing we heard, and one other thing that I wanted to bring up was trainers also took on new roles amid COVID. Again, in the extended enterprise, when you're talking about franchisees and franchise owners and people coming in from other organizations, the reality was there was so much uncertainty out there, especially in the business environment, that those trainers, while they were still pushing forward, were now taking on roles of counselors. We're now taking on roles of providing business support and helping people through the problems. There was one example of a franchisee out of Atlanta that said there was the #1 franchisee in this organization, and they said in the first training session that they were going to go under. They had been the longest established, most well-seasoned organization, and they told the trainer, "There's no way we're going to survive this." 6 months later, at the end of 2020, they were the #2 franchise, but they had survived. They had thrived based on the training the trainers had provided them, and the reshuffling of the opportunity, or the reorganization of how you approach customers, those kinds of things. And at the end, they said they would never go back, specifically go back to the standard way of doing it, because they were more efficient, and that was solely attributed to the trainers and the approach they took to educate through the process.
We had a question come in, and it's funny, the question was actually kind of prescient. It came in right before we even showed this material, and it says, Jim says that I see the trainers have been flexible and have reacted quickly. Do we have a sense on how training was received by the students?
Well, yeah, I think in a lot of cases, I think immediately trainers or trainees, people that were in the training sessions, were eager to learn, right? We know through this new delivery, we also know through the downtime that was experienced at the very beginning of this, people use it as a time not to sit on the sidelines, but use as a time to engage in training. And the new delivery paradigms gave them that opportunity. And so what we saw fairly consistently is a higher level of engagement from the trainees through this process and through these processes.
Right. So the next section we wanted that you found out a lot about is everyone's new best friend, virtual meeting technology. So let's talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, obviously we jumped into into all of this, right? This is, I think, the equivalent here is kind of like when we introduced e-learning many years ago, right? Virtual meeting technology has been around. We've had VILT as a learning modality and everything else, but virtual meeting technology, Zoom and GoToMeeting, all the stuff we're currently doing is different, and it really required a subtle hand to figure these things out, right? It couldn't be like what we did with e-learning, which was simply turn tomes of information from printed form into e-learning course and say it's a course, right? Those flopped miserably. And what we heard consistently is virtual meeting technologies were initially embraced, but realized very quickly they had limitations, right? What we heard from various organizations of various types, again, a large franchise organization had to adapt their training along the way. And one of those things, a good example was they had a 10-day franchisees onboarding session. This happens to be a different one I talked about earlier. But what ended up happening was they immediately pivoted and started delivering online. But among the excitement of delivery was, oh man, 8 hours on Zoom is not going to cut it here, right? We got to figure out different ways to do it. So it really required organizations to rethink what they were doing. First was really schedule adaptation, meaning shorten the sessions, may spread them out over a longer period of time, right? May have more frequent shorter sessions. We heard very commonly that 2 hours was the absolute maximum you can have people online this whole thing, right? We talked about, ILT scheduling. We adapt the scheduling process to make it more convenient for everyone, and adapt the content for better results along the way. The amazing thing about this is that when we heard these things, we also got better feedback. In the end, the results of the efforts to modify the training, especially when it was appropriate training for this kind of platform, meant that it was received better. They got higher feedback, they got greater engagement. Some other things that we heard along the way, that the virtual meeting technologies, a struggle they had, which was, how do you do one-on-one interaction? How do you do role playing and those kinds of things? The reality was that it provided some alternatives to that too. So the amazing thing we learned along the way is that it's a great technology. It's a double-edged sword here. It takes time to get it right, but you have a lot of different things that will drive it forward. 100% of the organizations that adapted their training programs reported that traditional ILT approaches and content didn't work, right? We know that content wasn't great. There was a general flow of what we talked about earlier: adapting the content, adapt the scheduling so it's more convenient, and adapt the content over for VMT, for virtual meeting technologies for better results. And that actually required, in some cases, pulling things back, putting out video, changing the blended learning paradigm to integrate better with this. Long form classes had to be adjusted. You couldn't do these things. Multi-day sessions were really, you had to have elongated multi-day sessions, right? You had to have shorter hour blocks and everything else along the way. We heard that some trainers did struggle to adapt, but others thrived. And lastly, on the role-playing front, and reinforcing activities, we actually heard that this had some benefit. Not only were you able to do breakout sessions and use on-site management, peer-to-peer management, what we also heard was these virtual sessions and the shorter delivery times and remote nature of them allowed a student to learn a skill, to actually go apply it in the field and bring it back for the next session and getting immediate feedback, unlike other instances where you go for 5 days or 10 days and then go out to the field and you've forgotten half of what you learned. So a lot of benefits to delivery here.
Yeah, and all of the stuff that you found, I love to see it because it lines up so well with what we found when we were talking to organizations. And we asked early on last year. We started surveying people in March, and we looked at the data from April 1st of last year. The most common things people were doing with their ILT was conference calls, VILT, and webinars, right? They were just picking everything up, putting it online, and putting it out. Because again, that's that initial reaction of, well, this is short term. But they quickly found out that the results were not great, right? It's just not the same experience. You can't take in-person content, stick it in a virtual environment and expect it to be the same. The trainers themselves, you can't expect a fantastic in-person trainer to do a fantastic job virtually. It's a different skill set. Some people have both, some people don't. And so what we saw over time is those things like webinars, VILT, and conference calls would drop, and other things started to rise, more use of e-learning modules and social tools and micro-learning. So, just like David was mentioning, the rise in the blend, right? So we can't just take people and recreate a 4-hour session virtually. We're going to have to break it up and maybe use a bunch of different modalities to reach people in different ways so that we can get this all done. And this also bears out in what companies were saying as far as where they're going to be investing. Our HCM Outlook study ran at the very end of last year, so clearly deep in the throes of the pandemic. And this is where people said that they were going to be doing moderate to heavy investment, at least from an L&D standpoint. So VILT, e-learning, micro-learning, expanding the learner experience, more social collaborative learning. So all of these elements is where people are going to be spending their money. They weren't really thinking, okay, let's dump a bunch of money into our ILT and figure out how to do that, differently and better for when people come back. And instead, it's broadening the palette of tools that we can use when we, are able to reach people. So looking at all of that, the research and the interviews and talking to folks, just there's the crux of it, right? Is that traditional ILT sessions just don't work in virtual meeting technology. It's not a one-to-one. Virtual meeting technology is great. We have to use it judiciously. I think people kind of went a little overboard in the beginning and have suddenly realized that Zoom fatigue is real. People don't want to spend that much time in those tools. If ever that old adage that this meeting could have been an email was ever made more true, it's put a bunch of people in a Zoom meeting, and quickly they start to realize is this really necessary? So if we are going to put people into some sort of platform like that, let's make it worth their while. Let's have a real purpose to it, and then combine different elements to create a different experience for people.
Right. One other thing on that we really think, and this next this section on VLT technologies and the one on hands-on that we're going to go into in a couple seconds, both lend themselves to future discussion, because people made this quick adaptation to move to virtual learning technologies, changing the blended learning paradigm, really trying to formulate that and make it a rich environment and find different ways to deliver that training in an online kind of way. But what we don't understand, and it's a constant issue in any of the training markets, but what is the effectivity of that? So it's going to be really important for us to go back and look at that and make sure we're seeing the metrics play themselves out, that they're not only is it being received, but is it really having the right impact in the organization as well.
Right. So let's dig into that. And this is, even again prior to the pandemic, this has been sort of a hot topic of discussion. Is it possible, right, as we move to more digital solutions and then go through digital transformation, can you replace, hands-on training? And I think, what you found, especially with the organizations and the audiences that you have worked with, is in a lot of cases, no.
Yeah, really, I think every organization we spoke to, wanted to make changes, and they made every effort along the way to adapt or change where they could. But if you're dealing with organizations that are doing hands-on product familiarization, you're doing technical training and services training, you're doing medical equipment sales and device, materials handling with high-risk situations. We've talked about aviation a couple times already. Those industries, those heavily regulated, those heavily controlled, certified, compliant industries, really didn't lend themselves neatly to that. And we saw organizations consistently trying to find different ways to manage that. We had one OEM that happens to be the largest ice machine manufacturer in the world, that fortunately, the timing of COVID actually was somewhat fortuitous. It happened just as their normal training season ended, because who would have thunk, as you head into April, May, June, July, August, that's the highest time of year that you need technicians fixing and repairing ice machines, right, around the globe. And what ended up happening was they really took a couple of steps back and looked at their training. First thing is, they, as an organization, as a leader in the industry, wanted to make sure that they were putting training out that was helpful as we were going early in this pandemic. Cafeterias shutting down, organizations shutting down. They wanted to make their training materials available, so they quickly converted, put videos together and guidance on how you put an ice machine to sleep for a long period of time. Can it be cleaned? All that kind of stuff. So they put their information out there and they converted that. They then really looked very carefully at what they were training and how they were doing it. And they actually, again, similarly landed on some of the new technologies. They started using video cameras and everything else, and they really had a great experience, and they were able to get most of the way there. As a matter of fact, the end result when they started training again without going back to the training facility was their training was well received, because they actually had solved some logistical problems. They had people that were able to look over a shoulder because they had perfect camera angle. They could hear because they weren't in the back of the room. All those things that were issues in their training facility, but they could not overcome the last piece, and that is a room that had 30 ice machines in it, connected to computers that could actually simulate various failures that technicians were challenged to go resolve to become certified on those things. And those are fairly consistent things. If you're turning a wrench on a car, look, you have to be trained. And what we heard were all those things needed to be done consistently, and there were limitations, right? 50% of the organization interviewed required hands-on IoT for the training and for product, service, and repair, and other kinds of things as well. They adapted as much as they possibly could to VMT where possible, right? But it wasn't an entire coverage. It was, let's peel away this piece, let's peel away that piece to limit amount of the time is necessary for in training. But it was never a full proxy where they're doing, and in some cases you couldn't get away, you couldn't do it, right? Instructors, as I said many times, were creative in using multiple video angles. We've heard parallels that, we heard of our kids going to school and teachers having experts with, a camera pointed down at the textbook and another camera up the screen and the whiteboard and everything else. So they were doing the exact same things. One of the neat things that was an outcropping of this that was often used as a proxy for the hands-on was they were able to directly create learning bites from the videos they were taking. Right, and this is across the board the organization was dealing with, and they've turned those into job aids. So you may not have the direct hands-on, but you had more frequent touch points with different delivery of that technology, right? In all cases, accommodations had to be made for programs for extensions, for certifications, compliance, and other things. And thankfully, we heard fairly consistently that outside agencies either were not looking over their shoulder, had proactively made adjustments or were more lenient with regards to the enforcement of those things, and in some cases gave credits back to them. So the important thing was they could handle that. In the case of warranty-based work, right, obviously those in the case of being able to deliver warranty-based things, you have to have trained technicians. One of the interesting things that we heard was organizations actually fielding teams of regional experts that could do the work and train along the way. We talked to an OEM that said, look, if I can't train this technology, I can't sell a brand new car. There was a very direct impact. But the dealerships wanted to sell this brand new car, but they had to have the experts to actually be able to deliver it. And what we ended up with, or what they ended up with, was these regional training experts. People weren't coming to the tech center to be trained. The regional training expert, tech expert would go out to that dealership, do the warranty repair, and actually train people in the dealerships. Because remember, the dealerships didn't close, right? Organizations were actively pursuing virtual technologies, but the speed and cost are primary barriers. That doesn't mean they don't want to go there, but a lot of cases we heard back that they aren't necessarily a full proxy for turning a wrench or having hands-on. And really, organizations are doing experience-based, meaning people that you need to drive a car, you need to feel the thing that's underneath you, you need to understand what it is to either be able to sell it or service, understand what's going on, right? Those were the organizations we found were the most hesitant to actually change what they were doing because they were favoring a return to pre-COVID experiences and those kinds of things. So it was a very consistent and fascinating conversation along the way.
Yeah, and as we jump into the recommendation on this section, a question came in about this specifically, and actually you touched on it a little bit there just after the question came in. But Jim was asking about VR and AR tools. Do you think those will inhibit or accelerate remote training for hands-on items? So maybe just expand a little bit more about the VR.
It is interesting. The virtual reality and virtual environment, I think it's a VA. I'm not specifically aware of that one. But the virtual reality, what we heard was a lot of organizations think it has a place, right? And we have heard some say that they were dabbling in it. I do think ultimately, given what we've seen in COVID, that organizations, especially highly technical ones, will look for more advanced ways to do this. Hopefully we don't have another pandemic, but the reality is that people have gotten used to being remote. There are other things that we haven't talked about here, which is putting a technician or taking a technician out of the field costs money, right? If we could do it virtually, there are benefits to doing that, both cost and experience wise.
Yeah, and Jim brings up the example of Ford, using VR to train techs on the Mustang E. I would also go, you could go back quite a few years, and BMW has a training program with AR, with augmented reality, where the technician's able to wear a pair of glasses, look into the engine bay of a BMW model, and have the different systems highlighted in different colors. They'll have an instruction on their display that says, remove, if you're going to remove the fan belt, you first need to remove this item, and it'll highlight the item and tell you what tool to use. And it's all overlaid over the actual real thing. So it's a combination of this blend that could also happen too, of both. So, I wouldn't say it's an inhibitor to remote training. I think once organizations figure out their barriers, as David mentioned, the speed and the cost is definitely something that's come way under control over the last couple of years as far as VR goes, and the processing power and the hardware, like the headsets and so forth. Mm-hmm. And more organizations are taking advantage of those things. I've seen examples of an airline training their technicians. They're able to put on a headset and do a full walk around of an actual jet, and look at all the parts and pieces and where they are. And you wouldn't be able to do that unless you were bringing them into the hangar. So there's a lot of opportunity and possibility there, I think.
Clearly, and I think there's one of the, in terms of an area to focus on, I think there's another one. I don't think this group of organizations that have fallen in this space were really able to make a lot of accommodation or adjustments or through COVID. And so I think this could be one of the ones that requires some more digging into, and I think it's going to be something that really drives the market going forward.
Yep. And so, obviously COVID, anything that's in person, that was the most impacted because people just couldn't gather, couldn't be in the same place. So, it's usually key to a lot of these different types of training areas, turning a wrench and fixing things and so forth. So, organizations need to develop the tool sets that allow trainers to do as much as close to hands-on as possible, so that you can limit the impact of anything like this in the future, or whenever other circumstances arise that require that people maybe couldn't get together. It doesn't have to be something as devastating as a multi-year pandemic, but any sort of circumstance that says, look, it doesn't make sense right now for everyone to be in this room. What can we do that gets us right up to the point where we need people to be physically touching something?
One more interjection there. We did in again, going back to my ice machine example, we had a ice manufacturer. They were actually able to use virtual technologies to train someone who was very remote, that they would have never seen before. And I think that's the kind of impetus that people are going to see going forward. How do we take what we've learned, impacts of COVID, apply them to more everyday kinds of things so we can extend the reach of our organization overall?
Yeah, 100%. So this sort of touches on something we talked about a little bit earlier with the depth and breadth of tools and technologies and modalities that you make available. So in your conversations, what you found from these folks is that if they were able to make easier access to the training, there was more opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, we saw fairly consistent. You go ahead and go to the next slide. With the reality was that there was an initial, there was a lot more ease of access, right? They higher level training engagement along the way. Initially, it was, hey, we don't know what to do, so let's fill our time with training. But then what was realized was there was an ease of access component of this. You were no longer sending someone away for a day's conference, a multi-day conference. So they were out of the office. They could do their job. They could do something while they were there, right? We also heard that consistently there was a broader audience of students, meaning that a lot of organizations lowered the barrier, said, look, if we're going to do it for 10, we can do it for 100. And what was happening was organizations were bringing more people along, so they're training more, right? It really provided an avenue for more people to train on key subjects and obviously brush up on their skills when oftentimes they were too busy doing their day jobs to do that. More regular engagement with partners and their staff, meaning it provided a way to have more frequent kinds of touch points. We heard organizations saying, look, we did this for training. We usually do our these centralized training activities in person. Now we're doing it virtually. And by the way, we can have them more frequently. We didn't need to wait for the next topic, the next quarterly event. We could literally have a weekly touch point. Hey, here's the latest thing we learned, whether it's on COVID or how to do something along the way. There was really a thirst for knowledge, learning bites and supporting information along the way. People wanted more. They didn't just want the training session. They wanted what's going on with COVID. They wanted they wanted more snippet kinds of information, which lent itself to a 15-minute, 30-minute coffee clatch kind of thing among your trainers. And really, it provided more flexibility to the organizations for engagement and topics of interest. And actually, one more point here that I didn't put on this slide is it also provided the training organization the ability to leverage their trainers in different kinds of ways, right? Building communities that couldn't be formed before, because now we're not talking about the South region or the North region or the West region or the international, whatever it might be. Now it could be, look, what time is convenient for you? And also you got cross-pollination. You could leverage resources. If Joe was the Southeast region trainer, he could now be leveraged across all these, going back to the earlier comments with regards to people being good at webinars and those kinds of things. So it really did provide a lot of new opportunities that I think we're just beginning to tap into as we went through this exercise of gathering data.
Yep, and again, lining up with our research is that if you look at the first two stats, it totals up to 76% of companies are going to be using digital learning at levels higher than they were prior to the pandemic. So they're going to get a lot of experience doing it over the last year and the next few months, and they're going to continue to use it. And it opens up a lot of different opportunities. Even if you can bring everybody back next week, in person, most companies are still going to be leveraging digital solutions to some degree or another. And, as they were sort of pointing out, it kind of solves a lot of these time and space issues. Suddenly you can reach somebody no matter where they are, and you can be very asynchronous about it if you need to be, and they can still get a relatively strong experience, even though it's happening asynchronously. So now you're reaching people, and geography and time are no longer barriers.
Agreed. Very much so.
Yeah, and so this move to virtual, like we said, it opens the door for more students. I mean, we're seeing this as a sort of an offshoot of the whole environment at a grand scale. Like, organizations are realizing that their entire talent pools are opening up to them. They're like, well, we don't have to look for people who live a half an hour from the office. We can look for people who live anywhere, and so that's happening now in a training standpoint. It's like it just opened up more opportunities to do different and unique things. But it's important to not, to lose sight of the impact it has. Students have gravitated towards the VLT approach. It's the same ones, right? That they're regular attendees traditional. So it's the whole point of this is keep that as part in your toolkit, right? It's going to serve you in the future, even if you get to a point where you're able to bring people back together, and should. And I'm not, I don't think David and I are suggesting that no one ever get back together in in-person training. Clearly, that's not the case. But you want to keep these digital tools at your disposal to be able to use them in new ways. And you know what? Maybe even though you're able to, maybe you shouldn't have an 8-hour in-person workshop. Maybe there's ways to do that differently and really maximize the time that you do have people together and do different things.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, Dave, I think it's a tool. It is a new training modality that you really need to adapt and perfect and use. And we consistently heard organizations say, we're not going to go back to what we did before, but we're also not going to go completely virtual either. And so there's going to be that balance, and it may involve getting, that quarterly, rather than doing biannual kinds of meetings, now we're doing quarterly meetings, and those quarterly meetings are virtual, and the regular biannual or other quarters are now in person, going back to what they were doing before. So again, just a lot of opportunity created by it.
Yep. So of course, as with anything that happens, there are cost and operational impacts of this, right? So companies really think about this. What does this mean for how we do things? What does this mean for the bottom line? So what did you find when you started to talk about sort of these nuts and bolts, dollars and cents stuff?
It was funny because again, I think I think overall the cost impacts in organizations were negligible, right? And negligible. Say this the right way to make sure everyone understands. in most cases, training revenues were offset by reduced expense related to travel and facility procurement, right? In a most profound extent, right? In 25% of the organization reported that the financial impacts were so positive, it would be hard to return back to pre-COVID operating paradigms. So these two things were fascinating. One, we thought, initially going in, this would be a huge impact, especially when you talk about the extended enterprise. Often people that are in the extended enterprise are paying for these training activities. They're paying to be part of this whole process, whether it's baked into their fees as an organization or otherwise they're paying for directly. What reality happened when what reality was that organizations, as they began to start to adapt and adjust, realized that they were no longer investing in procuring the facilities and sending people out, and allowed them to focus on those things. So when I say negligible, meaning at worst it was a wash, at best it was a huge improvement, right? And we saw those things along the way, and what we really see is that what we heard was operationally, most organizations that have adopted VMT are going to preserve most, if not all, of what they've done, because that the cost to deliver it is so effective, right? And so obviously that has to play into budgets and other things along the way. But we heard overall that the cost impacts were fairly negligible to the organization we talked to.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about maintaining and preserving the virtual training, and that sort of leads me into something that we found. And there's a lot on this slide, I understand, and you don't necessarily need to know the specific numbers, but if you look at the trend here, the way this is shaped by color, everything on the left, right, that light blue is where companies said we've decreased our use of this item, and as you move towards the right, it's we've increased our use of that, and then the levels grow from 20% or more, somewhere between 10 and 20%. And so you look at the things at the top where the increase of things like virtual synchronous classrooms, recorded webinars, conference calls, e-learning modules, videos, those are all pretty significant and pretty strong. And then where things have gone down, in-person ILT by a huge margin, of course, sending people to in-person, academic institutions, doing in-person simulations, those things were dropping. So it just sort of, mirrors that this is where things are headed, where things have gone. And so you're seeing a lot of companies getting exposure to tools that they either hadn't used before or hadn't used as extensively or didn't have as much experience with, and now they're gaining that experience, seeing the benefits, because all of these things are not simply tools to get you through this weird pandemic environment. These are actually very strong, valid training tools that have a strong impact and used properly, can drive outcomes and change behaviors. And so companies are seeing that, and then we just know that this adoption is going to remain. It's not going to fall off the face of the earth once everything gets whatever back to normal may be.
Right.
Yep. So yeah, so that's just the upshot of it all is that whatever the cost for conducting that, it allows you to sort of expand that offering and retain the benefits of doing it into the future, and actually get more participation and higher engagement while you're still doing the traditional ILT services. So again, it's not a one or the other observation as it was maybe in the beginning, where it was all ILT overnight. Now it's no ILT. We know that the future is both, and it's just a question of how well you're able to leverage those things and take advantage of both.
Completely concur.
Yep. And so just, the kind of like the silver lining as we wrap up here is one of the things we found in one of our studies. We just asked, do you feel like the learning function has come out of 2020 stronger? And, we honestly typically we ask questions and we feel like we already know the answer to them. We're sort of testing hypotheses. But this one, I didn't know how this was going to turn out. I thought, given the uncertainty and the impact on budgets, the companies weren't going to be sure. But 75% of companies said, you know what, we actually feel as though we've come out of this stronger. And I think a lot of that comes to the fact that it's elevated training's role in the organization as much more strategic and is much more critical when you really, got put under this microscope over the last 12 months. I think that's a big part of it. So, I mean, is that the sense, if you wrap up everything that you talked about with these organizations, is that the sense that you got as well, David?
With very few exceptions, that is the overwhelming response we got. I was equally skeptical or uncertain as to what we were going to get when we began these conversations. But the reality is that everyone, to a person that we interviewed, said this was, much, they were stronger for the whole thing.
Yep.
And
So,
in terms of
wrapping up.
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh yeah, I mean, we just run through these. But these are the things that we saw that, adaptation does have many forms. It isn't just one thing that needs to adapt. There's organizational adaptation. There's an adaptivity of the approach to how you take things, to the content that you're using. And so all of these things that we looked at fall into these, so the fact organizationally, yes, the big ship can turn. We can do this. Organizationally, trainers do want to train. So it's, we need to give them the tools that they need to do it. Whatever that approach happens to be, it's that transition to virtual. Benefits and drawbacks, it's good to understand what those are and then really leverage those benefits and keep an eye on the drawbacks. The content itself, we need to rethink the content if we're going to be operating in this dual world where things aren't all ILT or all virtual, but make sure we're creating content that works in the right place. And just knowing we have to be able to take people right up to the point that we can with that hands-on piece, if that's in what you guys do. But there are a lot of organizations, especially a lot of the ones that Dave and his organization work with, they need to go that last step and actually have hands-on to figure out how that fits into everything. And then, of course, easier access to the content and the material and the trainers just opens up all of those opportunities. Just sort of wrap it up then. And then I'll turn it to you, David. I had a good question that came in. I think it's a good discussion here in the last few minutes. John was asking, would you say that the organization is not taking this opportunity to pivot and structure whole new levels of remote virtual live training benefits into their structured curriculums and programs? Will that negatively impact their programs?
I think there's a general, I have a general feeling that is the case, right? Obviously, people reacted very quickly with regards to needing to adapt and keep training. We had ones that sort of sat on the sidelines because of the things we talked about earlier, and those that sort of like, oh, we haven't moved yet. But this is truly a new delivery paradigm, education delivery modality. Again, another tool in the blended learning toolbox, and it's going to become the norm, right? It's going to be the way we move along, and organizations that don't really avail themselves of it, make use of it, are going to struggle. Maybe not immediately, but as people get more familiar with it and comfortable, it is certainly going to be a limiting factor for them. I would agree.
Yeah, and I'll double down on that. I mean, our research is the same thing. Like I keep going back to this, but prior to the pandemic, all of our research points in this direction. We've always been making these recommendations to think more digitally, have more tools at your disposal to create a richer, broader learner experience, regardless of who the audience is. And all of those things are because they have a direct impact on outcomes. I mean, we just see it time and time again in all of our research. These aren't fads. These aren't nice to have. These aren't Band-Aids. These are legitimate, functional, effective tools for learning. And I would say that if you don't start to do this and incorporate these things, it will negatively impact you. And one of the big things about this whole pandemic is it's really opened people's eyes to what change really is. I say this a lot, but it's so true. For the years prior, everyone talked about the VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty. So we've talked about it, but I don't think anybody really had in their mind what that really meant. And then we were shown a great example, right? So it now broadened people's minds of what change really means, and are we actually change ready? And I think thinking like this, the way that we're talking, helps make the organization change ready. Not only does it get you where we are today, but now you're prepared for the next thing.
I completely agree, and I think the opportunity for us is still out there, right? I think proof that organizations can adapt, you can change. How do you do that? And one piggyback on your comment, as we return, very early part of the slide, as people return back to work and whatever that new world will be, they're used to this paradigm, and you need to be able to take advantage of it, leverage it, so we're not, hopefully we don't have to take another pandemic to be ready for it. Be prepared, know that you can shift, know that you can turn and react accordingly to it. So it's been a fun topic to talk about and go back and forth on. Are there any other questions out there?
Yeah, there was just one more that was very nuts and bolts, and I think it's for me. Will was asking about the distribution of company sizes surveyed. So for my data that I'm sharing, it falls pretty evenly across small, which would be 100 to 1,000 people, then mid-size, which would be about 1,000 to 5,000, and then large, 5,000 plus. It's about a third each, give or take a few percentages. So it's a pretty broad distribution of companies. And as far as industries go, it covers 35 industries that you can name, plus a handful of others that are very unique to that particular company. So it's a broad cross section of organizations. And I think Dave, you gave sort of a snapshot of the companies that you had spoken to for your material as well, right?
I mean, again, among the 40 we interviewed, we were down to organizations that were several hundred and up to organizations that were several 100,000, and the training programs that supported those. So we ran the gamut with regards to the types of organizations we talked to.
Yep, and I think to dig in maybe to what we could get at with that is that these things that we're talking about, they're not unique challenges by company size. I think a lot of times companies think about things in terms of, well, we're small, so it doesn't matter, or we're big enough to handle that. I think a lot of these challenges, happen irregardless. I can't believe I just said irregardless. Regardless of your organization's size, things do maybe get worse with and get exacerbated as companies get larger. But sort of that's technology's role, isn't it? It's to scale solid strategy and solid process. Regardless of the size of the company.
Completely agreed. Across the board, if you didn't know the organization that the people were talking to, who they belong to, it would be hard to tell the difference of the issues they were facing, which was, I think, pretty important along the way. So companies large and small experience the same things, just in different magnitudes and different volumes.
Yeah. All right. So I thank you so much, David, for all this. I think it's fascinating when you guys do this. You just go out there, put the boots on the ground, and find out what's really happening. It's so valuable. I mean, I know we do our research and we do interviews as well. And I think the most valid stuff we have are the word of mouth, direct from the people that are experiencing it. And so I really appreciate you taking the time and spending the hour with us today and sharing your insight.
Well, Dave, I appreciate the opportunity. Obviously, being able to marry what we found and with the data that you have, and being able to share this in a broader audience is important to us. We like to keep our finger in the marketplace. It helps us to understand what our customers and what our market is doing. And I think it's valuable across the way just to share information. We know for a fact that everyone we spoke to wanted to hear what everyone else was doing, and it's a fun way to be able to gather information, share it, and this is a unique opportunity to do that. So thanks you again to you, Brandon Hall, and the people that were online today.
Yep, and of course thanks to Latitude CG for providing the hour for us. So we managed, and thanks to you folks for asking the questions and taking part today. So that's great, and we just hope to see you on another webinar in the near future. So thanks everybody.
Thank you again, Dave.